Stuff I Want to Say with me, Chad Brooks. Well, listeners, this is it. We've hit double digits on this podcast, episode 10. I thank you so much for sticking around during our longer hiatus, but also, especially if you've come around from old school, back in the day, Threshing Floor podcast or Productive Pastor stuff. I appreciate you hanging on for almost years now. I was talking to somebody about this podcast last week, and I forgot how long I have been doing this in some way or some sort. But it's exciting to have you around. I also realized I think we're setting a record. My hope was always for Stuff I Want to Say to be a weekly podcast. And we actually might be hitting 3 weeks in a row with this episode. So as far as I know, I think that kind of puts it almost in the qualifications of a weekly podcast. But this is going to, as much as I can go back to old school Stuff I Want to Say, this episode is really going to kind of be that. One of those ones where I just meander around a handful of topics and things that I've been thinking about lately, but I also do want to talk about what I've been reading and what I've been listening to, because it's interesting. I'm excited about making quick show notes there. But I got a lot of feedback from people that listened to last week's episode with my friend Aaron Mansfield. I'm stoked that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having that conversation with him. I went back and listened to it several times because I'm still amazed at that story that he told at the very beginning of the episode about making his son go get Mr. Bebo, and Mr. Bebo came in with his belt off, wrapped around his hand, getting ready for a fight. So if you know me personally, you know that my outlook on ministry is different. Just kind of my outlook on life's a little different. And so much of that I garnered from working with Aaron for a couple of years and just being around this unique ministry place. And in some ways, I can almost say that I'm chasing the exact same thing now still that happened. And that might be a podcast episode for the future. What does it mean for us to chase the past in the present? I might need to write that down. But this episode is going to be, like I said, more of a meandering thing. What I want to talk about is something I finished that I mentioned on last week's episode, was this reading of the Apostle Paul. And I kind of hinted at it a little bit in that episode. I've hinted at it on social media. If you want to follow me anywhere, you can find me on all the networks at Rev Chad Brooks. But I did a chronological read of Paul, and this is what it looked like. And it was just this interesting thing I have, and I did it for a sermon, and I'm going to post all 4 of these sermons on this feed probably Monday if I have the time. We'll see. I'll tell you why I'm saying if I have the time later on this episode. But I preached a message on just the missional flexibility and the missional decision-making of the Apostle Paul. And this started several years ago when I did a deeper devotional reading of Paul. And in it, I realized, like, man, this guy can change his method really quick. Like, he is highly adaptable. And I became fascinated with Paul and his adaptability, not his changing his mind or changing what he believes about God, but changing the way that he's willing to reach people. And so I always said, I want to read Paul and more. I want to understand more of this. And then this year, as I began prepping and planning my own Bible reading until we decided to do a 365-day read with the church, I was considering doing some sort of a chronological read. And I was fascinated by the chronological stuff, really in the Old Testament, but also in the life of Paul. And so a few weeks ago, when I realized that this sermon was going to be preached soon, I just made this quick, just chronological reading list of Paul's letters and Acts and how they all flow together. I've got a video I've recorded some pieces of to talk more about this, but I'll talk about the things that inside of it there. But y'all, this is what I wanted to share this morning, or whenever you're listening to it. It's 10 o'clock at night, sitting in my kitchen right now recording this. But I finished it up on a Wednesday. Typically on Wednesdays, I do sermon preparation all day long. And so I finished this up on a Wednesday. And I'm coming, just reading I think I sat down that day to read the last bit of Acts and then all of Paul's letters that he wrote in captivity. And I get to the end of 2 Timothy and I read it, and I could hear Paul's brokenness in his own words and the way he's talking to Timothy, the way he's interacting with Timothy in so many ways. Just like, man, this is just to see this guy over the course of this ministry. It was different. It was really, really different for me. And so I finish it up around lunch. And on Wednesdays, I'm a creature of habit, and I do the exact same thing every Wednesday. And one of the things I do is I go to this barbecue joint that's 2 doors down from this co-working space that I have a spot at that I work at on Wednesdays. And I'm sitting there at the bar eating my lunch, and I almost start crying because I realize that just the level that Paul completely gave himself to the task. And then to see the end of these words, and Acts ends on this really high note. We don't know about Paul's death. But in Timothy, especially in 2 Timothy, you can tell that he's getting tired, that he's getting worried, that he needs comfort. All of these just absolute human emotions that happen. We see them inside of Paul, and it y'all, that chronological reading thing just is doing something. It did something to me. So, like I said, I've shot a video to talk more about my idea of why I wanted to do this. And when I do that video, I'll release the reading plan. It was not hard. People have asked me for it a bunch, and I just literally Googled chronological New Testament and wrote down the parts that apply to that. And so it's just different. And I talked about this somewhere, but I've not read that much at all this month. It's actually bothering me quite. I'm realizing now how much of a problem it is. And this month has just been abnormally busy. It's been crazy. It's been stupid. I've allowed myself to just go to my end of my rope in some ways that I know I'm not comfortable with. And one of the ways I talked about that a few weeks ago on this podcast, one of the ways I can tell that is I'm not reading, which means I'm not doing all of these things that I need to do for my emotional and for my spiritual health. But I started a week and a half ago reading N.T. Wright's Biography of Paul. More than halfway done with that. I love it. I highly recommend it. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. It's gorgeous, and I'm shooting really, really heavy to have it done by the end of the month so I can finish a book this month. But also, I want to get that book done before something that happens next week, which I will talk about later on in the podcast. And the last thing, just the kind of meandering lapse of things I've been thinking about this week, I shared an image on Instagram stories, and people made fun of my handwriting because you really cannot read my handwriting to save my life. But with Psalms 37, 39 through 40, and it's this thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I'll read you the scripture, then I'll kind of talk about it a little bit. And this is what it says: "The Lord rescues the godly. He is their fortress in times of trouble. The Lord helps them, rescuing them from the wicked. He saves them, and they find shelter in him." One of the things that I wrote, and I kind of shared this on Instagram stories, is asking the question of this: how often do we admit that we need shelter? How often do we admit that we are at the point where we need help to provide sheltering presence, like this level of emotional, of spiritual, of physical turmoil? But then I realized the greater question side of it is, how much do we wish we could admit that we need shelter? I mean, how much do we wish that we could just say, hey, I need something right now? And it's kind of heartbreaking if you think about it, that we don't have the level of relationships where we can say that to people. We don't have the level of trust where we can say that. And as I've been reading the Psalms lately, a couple of different times a day, because I'm in a couple of different reading plans, we see this as just this major theme in Psalms of people just saying, God, you are sheltering me right now. You are protecting right now. You are vindicating me right now. And I just realized, I don't engage with God that much in that way. And I probably need to. I need to begin thinking like that level of, and also if I'm not putting myself out in situations to where I am that beyond my own ability, I have to ask myself honest questions about, am I living a life that is deep enough in the mission and purpose of Christ? Or am I leading people at this way? It's the sub-thought as a pastor, as a spiritual leader. And so I've just been thinking about this idea of sheltering and refuge. I'm just reading it all throughout the Psalms. So just sharing that. I love to hear your feedback on any of those things, especially on Twitter. I'm engaged pretty well over there. So a couple things, what I've been reading, what I've been listening to, I want to kind of put in front of you. So one of the things I've been reading, N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul. It is great. But something else, I've been listening to two things that are just awesome right now. You should go do both of them. One, John Tyson, a pastor at Church of the City in New York, has been preaching a sermon series called Altars. I finished the last sermon this morning when I was driving around with work. It was a February sermon series, but just 4 sermons on altars. And I will link to that as much as I can in the show notes. But really the last episode, I think it was Altars of Place, where he talks about revival and renewal. And I'm drinking that Kool-Aid really, really deep right now. I'm loving these stories of revival, what that means. The second thing I'm listening to, and I'm about to start reading some whenever I get done with things, is Pete Scazzero has a podcast, Emotionally Healthy Leadership. He also has a discipleship program called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. And he has been on a couple of other podcasts. John Mark Comer did a long-form conversation with him that was released, I think, through Bridgetown Church's podcast. But man, everything this guy says is speaking to my soul right now. Just everything about the way he talks about things. And so all of these people are part of this thing. I don't know what I would call it. I don't know if it's a movement. It's not a denomination. It's a persuasion, maybe. And Pete seems to be kind of like an elder statesman, an influencer, that group of people. And also, it's wrapped up in Edward Friedman's family systems theory, which I love. And it's thoughtful discipleship. It has elements of monasticism and Sabbathing. And it's every single thing I love right now. So go do this. Go check out those 2 things. Go check out John Tyson's sermon series on altars, and go check out Pete's Emotionally Healthy Leadership podcast. But I've been hinting at something coming up, and this is why we might not have a podcast next week. If we do, it will probably be different. But Meredith and I, my wife, are leaving on Monday to go to the Holy Land with my dad and my mom and my dad's church. And I'm really excited about that trip. I'm really excited about all the things that it can be and it means. But I also want to be really present while I'm there. And so I don't know, I doubt we're going to have podcast episodes for the next 2 weeks. We might have something kind of fun and something different as part of this. I'm not sure yet. But thank you so much for tuning in. This is a new podcast still. If you like this, wherever you listen to this, do me a favor and just review and rate it. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. That helps out other things. But I'm excited to have this show, to do this thing with you. But until next time, I'm Chad Brooks. This is stuff I want to say, and I hope you have a good one.